Welcome back to Let the Quran Speak. The term jihad has very negative connotations. We'll be looking at what it means within the Islamic tradition. Brother Shabir, what does jihad mean, to begin?
Well, the term jihad in Arabic, actually, you're right, it has, for the public, a negative sort of connotation now. But in the Islamic tradition, it's a noble concept. It really means to strive. The word jahada in Arabic means to strive. Juhud means struggle. To strive, jahada means to really make effort at something. And it could be at many different levels. Usually, as an Islamic term, it means to make effort for something good, to bring about good in one's own life, in one's own person, and in one's society.
Were there different types of jihad? For example, jihad of the soul, other sorts of jihad?
Yes, struggle can be at many different levels. There's the personal level at which one is just simply striving to make oneself a better person. There is a struggle within the community to eradicate things like poverty and disease and things that harm other people, crime and so on. People speak of a war on drugs or a war on crime. Well, they're speaking of a certain jihad without using that particular Arabic term. And then there is also a military sort of jihad whose existence we should not deny, but we should caution that it is accompanied by prescriptions, by restrictions and by stipulations and conditions which cannot be ignored. There is a properly done jihad, and then there is one that is improperly done. The properly done jihad will bring about the pleasure of God. The one that is improperly done will, of course, incur His anger and wrath.
You mentioned the properly done jihad. What would be the purpose of jihad then?
Well, if we speak about jihad on the person, jihad on the nafs, this in fact is mentioned in the hadith as the greatest jihad, is the greatest struggle. And that is the purpose of that would be to make oneself a better person. To please God in this life actually requires a constant struggle. If you have elderly parents with you and you are trying to serve them and thereby to please God, well, that requires a constant struggle. If you have children and you're trying to raise them in the Islamic tradition with all of the challenges to that in this life, well, that requires a constant struggle, constant supervision, constant guidance, being there for your children. This is a jihad, it is a struggle. So there are many different levels of struggle. If we speak about this society, leaving things as they are and minding one's own business seems to be the path of least resistance. Most people will fall into that part. There are people who make things happen, and there are people who watch things happen. Most of us would rather watch things happen. And of course, there are some people who wonder what happened. They're totally clueless. But we should be clued in, and we should not just simply be watching as silent spectators, but we should be active in our societies, righting wrongs and bringing about greater good. So that requires a constant struggle. That is the jihad, not simply just minding your own business, but actively making the betterment of humanity your own business.
To what extent is the military aspect of jihad significant? I mean, how, let's say you have this concept jihad, what percentage of it would be military jihad?
Well, a military struggle is a last resort. Most countries in the world to this day would have a military body that ensures the defense of the nation. And even if you call it a peacekeeping force to reflect the outlook of the nation, as we do in Canada, we have a peacekeeping force. We establish by that we want to maintain peace, but by having a military unit, we are in fact acknowledging that sometimes peace has to be kept by going to war. It becomes inevitable in some circumstances as a last resort when all kinds of diplomatic solutions fail. But it is the diplomatic solutions that we should always constantly work to bring about, so that we do not have to go to war, because war as a last resort is something entirely undesirable. The Quran says in Surah 2, كُتِبَ عَلَيْكُمُ الْقِتَالُ وَهُوَ كُرْهٌ لَكُمْ. God has made it necessary for you to fight at times, and that is disagreeable to you. So there is an acknowledgement that, in fact, war does have its disagreeable side.
Were there any guidelines put out by God as to when jihad should be performed? Military.
If one reads the Quran carefully, one will find that there are a few instances or a few justifications for what would be termed a just war. One passage in Surah 4, verse 75, speaks about the mustad'afin, those weak and oppressed people, especially women and children, who are crying out for someone to relieve them of a certain oppressor. If there are oppressive regimes, or if there are dictators, or if there are tyrants who are causing great harm to the populace, and the only way to bring about good for large numbers of people is by a military confrontation with that oppressive regime, then this would be a justification for going to war, again as the last resort after diplomatic efforts fail. Now, of course, going to war does not mean that any individual can go to war. An individual would have to be represented by a leader, and that leader would have its military unit. The leader would try to enter into negotiations with the other. When negotiations fail, then there will be the reprisal that would be threatened of a military confrontation. Of course, there are things that go before that. There are sanctions and so on. But it is not for an individual to say, okay, I don't like that regime, or I think that regime is oppressive, and therefore I can go to war with it. That is not war, that is chaos. And the Quran speaks again and again against chaos, against fasad, against corruption, against anarchy. Sometimes it is better to live with the situation bad as it is, rather than to provoke a kind of unrest which would cause the loss of more lives and cause the suffering of a greater number of people to a larger degree than the existing suffering that you're trying to remove. So the proper way to do it is to have a body politic which then confronts the other and tries to negotiate with it, and as a last resort takes it to the battlefield.
All right, thank you for that.
Welcome.
Coming up, we'll try and figure out how this idea of jihad has gone out of control, how people are claiming to be performing jihad in ways that don't seem to be within the Islamic tradition. We'll be looking at that later in the show, so stay with us.